Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in our chats with Emily, as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson. We are in the Johnson edition and we turn out a poem 414. "'Twas like a maelstrom with a notch." Now, this is in many ways a poem that takes us back to 410. We were there just recently. You'll maybe remember it. The first day's night had come, and grateful that a thing so terrible had been endured, I told my soul to sing. She said her strings were snapped, her bow to atoms blown, and so to mend her gave me work until another morn. And then a day as huge as yesterday's in pairs unrolled its horror in my face until it blocked my eyes. My brain begun to laugh. I mumbled like a fool, and though 'tis years ago, that day, my brain keeps giggling still. And something's odd within that person that I was, and this one do not feel the same. Could it be madness? This? Now, some have seen Emily as Gothic represented in this poem. Some have seen this as another theodicy. Many readers have seen this as her response to the book of Job. You will remember the question of Job, namely, terrible things happen to him and he refuses to curse God and die, as his wife will suggest it to him. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at LearnStrong.net. Down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily is our playlist. I'm hopeful that you've worked through our set of introductory comments as well as the preceding 413 poems. We just finished with 413, I Never Felt at Home. And if you have been following our poem study, you know that this poem is placed in the middle of other poems where Emily is trying to understand some of the pain or suffering in her life. Now, as in many of those poems, we don't have a specific reason why Emily is so tortured, but we definitely know it happens. In this poem, we will see deliverance, or at least relief, happening in three similes that are somewhat, one scholar has called them hyperbolic. The first will be the paddle wheel of, back to poem 10, the ratchet wheel of Maelstrom, almost reminding us of Odysseus and his Charybdis along with the monster Scylla. Then we will have a goblin or a fiend, and then finally we will have a judge who is able to postpone a hanging right at the final moment. One scholar has said nowhere is Dickinson's desire to speak as representative more clearly demonstrated. She'll say it this way: "'Twas like a maelstrom with a notch that nearer every day kept narrowing its boiling wheel until the agony toyed coolly with the final inch of your delicious hem, and you dropped, lost, when something broke and let you from a dream. As if a goblin with a gauge kept measuring the hours until you felt your second way helpless in his paws, and not a sinew stirred could help, and sense was setting numb, when God remembered and the fiend let go, then overcome. As if your sentence stood pronounced and you were frozen, led from dungeon's luxury of doubt to gibbets and the dead, and when the film had stitched your eyes, a creature gasped, 'Reprieve!' Which anguish was the utterest then, to perish or to live?" Now, many have read this as almost like one long sentence that culminates with a final question: which is better, to live through pain and suffering or just to die from the pain and suffering? First of all, it isn't clear what it is that's like this maelstrom, although all of her language is, of course, the language of tortured pain and suffering. And in that regards, again, we're back to poem 410. A maelstrom, that whirlpool, powerful whirlpool, we will see in poems 502 and 721, and as other kinds of maelstroms, or challenges we might think, right? With a notch. Now, the only time notch gets used in this way is in this poem. It's almost as if she wants to make the challenge of the Maelstrom even more demanding. That nearer every day it's like you're going down. Think of Yeats's Gyre in Second Coming or in Sailing to Byzantium, both poems we've studied together at learnstrong.net. That nearer every day, notice capitalized, kept narrowing his boiling wheel, back to poem 10, as we've said. This reminds us of our study of King Lear, Act 2, Scene 4. You'll remember Axon's wheel of fire. You'll remember it there. Until the agony. And you'll remember agony from poem 412. We saw it in poem 241. We saw it in 1243 that we'll be seeing later. Notice the agony toyed, only use, by the way, coolly, I think that may be the key word of the poem, with the final inch of, and then all of a sudden, it's not my delirious hymn, but it's your delirious hymn. Much has been made of the fact, and again, this is one of the reasons we call it Chats with Emily, that Emily has this ability, much like Walt Whitman in our study of the poems of Leaves of Grass that we call Talks with Walt. You remember Crossing Brooklyn Ferry, we said that there is this ability of Emily and Walt to reach out in the poem and somehow bring you into the poem. It's quite remarkable. Your delirious hymn. In other words, you're going down for the last time and all that we can see is the hem of a dress. And you dropped. Lost. And then all of a sudden it shifted. When something broke and let you from a dream. Now, in some ways this is almost like our study of the Christmas Carol and Scrooge. Right at the final moment, when he sees his own tombstone and he thinks it's the end, and he's begging for one more day of life, he awakens from the dream and he has been rescued. So there's our first, right? And then she'll say it as if, it's as if, the second simile, a goblin. Now we're going to see goblin in several poems, 511, 590, 646. But I'm going to pay attention to 512, because when we hit 512, we're going to come back to it this way. The soul has bandaged moments when too appalled to stir, she feels some ghastly fright come up and stop to look at her, salute her with long fingers, caress her freezing hair, sip, goblin from the very lips the lover hovered o'er, unworthy that a thought so mean accost a theme so fair. The soul has moments of escape, when bursting all the doors she dances like a bomb abroad and swings upon the hours, as do the bee, delirious born, long dungeoned from his rose. Several of these words end up in the poem we're studying in 414. Touch liberty, then no more, then no more. But noon in paradise, the soul's retaken moments, when felon led along with shackles on the plumed feet, we're going to see that image in a bit, and staples in the song, the horror welcomes her again, these are not braid of tongue. That translinguistic moment, and it almost seems as if that's what's happening here, but now we are as if a goblin with a gauge only use of that word is here. We can't think of these images without maybe thinking of Jonathan Edwards' Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. We've given full lectures at learnstrong.net. Remember the ideas from that sermon. It's like you're being held over the fire like a spider over a fire by a string. As if a goblin with a gauge kept measuring the hours until you felt your second way, helpless in his paws like a force, a goblin force. Notice how we move from these images. First of just the maelstrom, the spinning whirlpool, to now a goblin with a certain level of intentionality that wants to bring about this pain. And not a sinew stirred could help. We're back to this notion of coolly from earlier. There's no help. It's a helpless feeling. And sense was setting numb. Remember when we hit poem 280, that she said it this way: I felt a funeral in my brain, and mourners to and fro kept treading, till it seemed that sense was breaking through. And when they all were seated, a service like a drum kept beating, till I thought my mind was going numb to the word that we just read. And then I heard them lift a box and creak across my soul with those same boots of lead again. Then space began to toll, as all the heavens were a bell, and being but an ear, and eye, and silence, some strange race wrecked solitary here. And then a plank in reason broke, and I dropped down, and hit a world at every plunge, and finished knowing. Then, notice here, the sense is setting numb when God remembered. Now, this is interesting. It's as if she imagines deity is somehow forgetful of our pain and our suffering. Again, we think of Job, don't we? And the fiend let go, then, overcome. We cannot help but think of Milton in Paradise Lost in a line like this. As if your sentence, and now to the third and final simile, as if your sentence, go back to poem 412 for sentence, stood pronounced, and you were frozen lead from dungeon's luxury of doubt. I mean, think about the power of the word frozen as it relates to our study of Dante and the Divine Commedia, especially Inferno, where the deeper you get into hell, it's not hot, it's cold, right? The frozenness of it all. From dungeon's luxury of doubt to gibbets and the dead. In other words, it's like, okay, there you are sitting in your dungeon. Notice again, from a whirlpool to a goblin to now a judge who is going to sentence you to an unfair death. Again, we cannot help but think about her reading of Christ's, and Christ's, of course, crucifixion and the judgment that preceded it. From dungeon's luxury of doubt, in other words, maybe they'll let me off, to the gibbet, where obviously you're going to get jacked, and the dead. And when the film, poem 504 will come to mind here, when the film had stitched your eyes, amazing, it's verbiage, a creature gasped, reprieve. In other words, stop, we can't help but think here of Poe's Pit and the Pendulum. You'll remember the ending of that when we've given lectures at learnstrong.net. That one, by the way, was published in 1842. This poem, 20 years later, in 1862, it was when she wrote it. So it's like three things. What is this horror like? It's like a whirlpool. It's like a goblin. It's like a judge that at the last second allows you to not be executed. Which, she asks now the question. It's a compelling question. Which anguish, she uses this word in 31 poems, was the utterest, dash, then, dash, to perish, comma, or to live, question mark. Well, what's the point of a poem like this at 2A? I think the scholar Wolfe has maybe said it as well as anybody can. We cannot escape death, but we can escape the fear of death. And I think this is the point. As we have said a number of times, Emily's theodicy, why must terrible things happen, suggests that when bad things happen, we don't ask, why did this happen to me? But rather we learn to ask, why did this happen for me? Why? Because when we ask, why did this happen to me, there is no real answer. We are imagining ourselves as somehow a victim in a universe from which there is no extrication. But when we ask, why did this happen for me, we can see pain, suffering as a propedeutic, instructional. We can learn something from it. It's not that we're celebrating the pain or the suffering. Yippee, I get to have more pain and suffering. No, but we accept that it happens. And then we find a way to live through it. It's Nietzsche's that which does not destroy me makes me stronger, no doubt. At 2B, notice the power of you, right? It inflects, one scholar has said, inflects intimacy on the horror. And of course, there's all kinds of macabre words that are a part of this. Maelstrom, boiling, agony, goblin, pause, fiend, dungeon, gibbets, anguish, the language of suffering and pain. Emily's brilliant at it. At 3A, think of all of the classic texts of suffering. We've mentioned, of course, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. We mentioned Job. We mentioned Dante. Obviously, the Odyssey comes to mind. We mentioned Poe's Pit and the Pendulum, right? Saved at the last. Think about Golding's Lord of Flies and the way that that one will happen at the end. Think of Kafka and so many of his stories that will play a similar game. I'm now thinking, of course, of Hunger Artist. But, I mean, just think about so many stories of Kafka that will play a similar kind of game, where you're in senseless suffering and then all of a sudden, for whatever reason, something changes. But you don't know why. Finally, at 3B, to own a poem like this, what was a time when you met anguish and you survived. And what did you learn through that experience? I'm really hopeful that Emily's challenging you. Thank you.